The Rouge River had been rising for 3 days. By the evening of April 7th, 1947, the waters had climbed high enough to flood the powerhouse that sat at the edge of the Fairlane estate. The turbines that Henry Ford had installed decades earlier, machines that had once represented the pinnacle of private electrical generation, fell silent beneath the muddy current. And so, as darkness settled over Dearborn, Michigan, the 56-room mansion went black. Inside, servants moved through hallways with candles and oil lamps, their shadows stretching long across walls lined with artifacts from a vanished century. The estate's elaborate electrical system, its internal telephone network, its hidden listening devices, all of it rendered useless by the same natural force that Ford had spent his life trying to master. The industrialist who had electrified the American automobile, who had lit the factories that changed the world, now lay in a bedroom, illuminated only by flame. He was 83 years old. His body had been failing for months, weakened by successive strokes that had slowly dismantled the mind that once conceived the assembly line. Clara Ford, his wife of nearly 60 years, remained close. So did a small number of household staff, their footsteps muffled on carpets that had absorbed decades of secrets. At approximately 11:40 that night, Henry Ford stopped breathing. The official cause of death was recorded as a cerebral hemorrhage. The announcement, when it came, was met with an outpouring of public grief that seemed to confirm his status as an American titan, a farm boy from Michigan who had democratized the automobile and, in doing so, reshaped the rhythms of modern life. Flags were lowered. Tributes poured in from presidents and industrialists. The newspapers ran photographs of the man in his prime, confident, visionary, unstoppable. But within the walls of Fairlane, a different atmosphere prevailed. The estate that had been Ford's refuge for more than 3 decades held a weight that no eulogy could capture. Those who had worked there, who had witnessed the private rituals and the slow accumulation of obsessions, understood that the public image was incomplete. The man who died that night in candlelight was not simply the folk hero of American manufacturing. He was something more complicated, more guarded, more controlling, more consumed by suspicions that had deepened with every passing year. Fairlane had been designed as a sanctuary, a place where Ford could escape the pressures of his empire and cultivate a life connected to the natural world. But over time, the estate had transformed into something else. A fortress of ideology, a site of surveillance, a monument to a world view that grew darker as the century advanced. The listening devices embedded in its walls had recorded conversations without the knowledge of guests. The private security apparatus had monitored employees and visitors alike. The man who preached simplicity had constructed an elaborate system of control that reached into every corner of his domain. None of this appeared in the obituaries. The tributes emphasized his contributions to industry, his philanthropic efforts, his championship of the common worker. They did not mention the anti-Semitic newspaper he had published for nearly a decade, or the award he had accepted from Nazi Germany, or the private intelligence network he had built to root out perceived enemies within his own company. They did not speak of the complex, sometimes contradictory figure who had retreated behind the iron gates of Fairlane as the world he had helped create moved beyond his control. The flood that darkened the estate on the night of his death carried a symbolism that no scriptwriter could have invented. The man who had mastered electricity, who had illuminated factories and highways, and the aspirations of a nation, died in a house without power. The systems he had built, mechanical and ideological alike, had failed him in the final hours. Clara Ford would remain at Fairlane for another 3 years, living quietly in the vast rooms that had once hosted dignitaries and captains of industry. When she died in 1950, The estate passed into an uncertain future, its secrets sealed within walls that had witnessed triumphs and compromises in equal measure. To understand how this happened, we have to go back. The farm where Henry Ford was born stood on land his father had cleared from Michigan wilderness. It was July of 1863, and the nation was tearing itself apart in civil war, though the conflict felt distant in the quiet fields outside Dearborn. William Ford, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in America with little more than determination, had built a life of modest prosperity. The farmhouse was sturdy, the crops reliable, the expectations clear. A son born into this world was expected to inherit the land, to continue the cycle of planting and harvest that had sustained generations before him. But Henry Ford was not suited to the rhythms of agricultural life. From his earliest years, he displayed a restlessness that troubled his father and fascinated his mother. Mary Littlegott Ford recognized something in her son, a mechanical intuition that seemed to arrive fully formed, as though he had been born understanding how things worked. He dismantled watches to study their movements. He repaired tools that older men had abandoned as hopeless. He wandered the fields, not to tend crops, but to observe the machinery that made farming possible, already imagining how it might be improved. When Mary Ford died in 1876, something shifted in the boy. He was 12 years old, and the loss hollowed out whatever affection he had held for the family farm. Years later, he would say that the house became a watch, without a mainspring after her death, a machine that continued to exist, but no longer possessed purpose. The land that his father loved became, for Henry, a prison of repetition and manual labor. He longed for something else, though he could not yet name it. At 16, he walked to Detroit. The city was transforming itself into an industrial center, its streets crowded with machine shops and foundries, and the restless energy of young men seeking their fortunes. Ford found work as an apprentice, learning the trades that would later make him wealthy: metalworking, steam engines, the emerging science of internal combustion. He absorbed knowledge with an intensity that impressed his employers, though his social manner remained awkward, his ambitions largely private. He returned to Dearborn in his 20s, married Clara Bryant, and seemed for a time to settle into a conventional life. He operated a sawmill, managed timberlands, and appeared to accept the rural existence his father had always envisioned for him. But the machines never stopped calling. In a small workshop behind his home, Ford began experimenting with gasoline engines, working late into the night on designs that his neighbors regarded with suspicion or indifference. The breakthrough came in 1896. In a brick shed in Detroit, Ford completed his first horseless carriage, a simple, ungainly vehicle he called the quadricycle. It had 4 bicycle wheels, a 2-cylinder engine, and a tiller for steering. On a June night, he discovered that the machine was too wide to fit through the shed door, so he took a sledgehammer and knocked out the bricks himself. Then he drove into the streets of a sleeping city, the noise of his engine announcing something that none of the witnesses could fully comprehend. He was 32 years old. The age of the automobile had not yet begun, would not truly begin for another decade, but Ford had glimpsed its outline. He understood, perhaps before anyone else in America, that the future belonged to machines that could move ordinary people across distances that had once seemed impossible. The horse, the train, the limitations of geography itself, all of it would yield to the gasoline engine, if only someone could build a car cheaply enough for the common worker to afford. This insight would become his obsession, the fixed point around which all other considerations would eventually orbit. But the path from that first midnight drive to the assembly lines of the Rouge River plant would be neither straight nor simple. Ford would fail twice before succeeding, burning through investors and partnerships, earning a reputation for stubbornness that bordered on recklessness. He quarreled with business partners who wanted to build expensive cars for wealthy buyers. He insisted, against all prevailing wisdom, that the future lay in volume, in producing millions of identical machines at prices that would drop with every improvement in efficiency. The men who dismissed him as a dreamer would later work for him, or compete against him, or watch from the margins as he reshaped the world. But in those early years, before the Model T, before Fairlane, before the darkness that would shadow his later decades, Henry Ford was simply a man with a vision and the mechanical skill to pursue it. He had not yet learned what power could do to a person, how it could magnify both genius and the faults that genius often conceals. The Model T arrived in October of 1908, and within a decade it had become the most successful commercial product the world had ever seen. The car itself was not elegant. Its design prioritized function over aesthetics, durability over comfort. Ford famously declared that customers could have any color they wanted, so long as it was black, a statement that captured both his pragmatism and his growing conviction that he alone understood what the public needed. But the genius of the Model T lay not in the vehicle itself. It lay in how the vehicle was made. Ford and his engineers developed a system of production that broke the manufacturing process into hundreds of discrete steps, each performed by a worker trained to execute a single task with mechanical precision. The assembly line, as it came to be known, reduced the time required to build a chassis from 12 hours to 93 minutes. Costs plummeted, output soared. By 1927, when production finally ceased, more than 15 million Model Ts had rolled out of Ford's factories. The scale of this achievement reshaped American geography. Roads were paved to accommodate the flood of automobiles. Gas stations appeared at crossroads that had never known commerce. Suburbs sprawled outward from city centers, made possible by workers who could now live miles from their places of employment. The Model T did not merely satisfy a demand. It created an entirely new way of living, a reorganization of space and time around the private automobile. Ford understood, perhaps instinctively, that his workers were also his customers. In January of 1914, he announced that the Ford Motor Company would pay its workers $5 a day, more than double the prevailing wage in American manufacturing. The announcement made headlines around the world. Thousands of men descended on the Highland Park plant, hoping to secure positions that promised not merely survival, but something approaching prosperity. The $5 day was celebrated as an act of enlightened capitalism, and in some respects it was. Ford recognized that well-paid workers would buy the products they made, creating a virtuous cycle of consumption and production. But the policy carried conditions that the newspaper reports often failed to mention. To qualify for the full wage, workers had to submit to investigations by the Ford Sociological Department, a team of inspectors who visited homes, interviewed family members, and assessed whether employees met the company's standards of moral conduct. Men who drank, who gambled, who kept untidy houses, or failed to maintain proper domestic arrangements could be denied the premium wage. Ford was not simply paying his workers more, he was purchasing the right to govern their private lives. This impulse toward control would deepen as Ford's wealth and influence grew. The same mind that had revolutionized manufacturing began to develop theories about society, economics, and history that bore little resemblance to the pragmatic engineering that had made him famous. He became convinced that international bankers, a category he associated almost exclusively with Jewish financiers, were manipulating world events for their own benefit. He saw conspiracies in labor movements, in political reforms, in the cultural changes that accompanied the new century. In 1918, Ford purchased a small newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Over the next decade, the paper published a series of articles attacking Jewish influence in American life. The content was vicious, drawing on centuries-old stereotypes and fabricated documents like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Ford's name appeared on the masthead, lending the authority of America's most celebrated industrialist to material that would later be cited approvingly by Adolf Hitler. The series was eventually collected into a 4-volume set called The International Jew, which was translated into multiple languages and distributed around the world. Ford would later issue an apology, claiming that he had been unaware of the paper's content. Few who knew him believed this explanation. The Dearborn Independent was not a minor sideline. It was a project Ford personally championed, part of a broader effort to shape public opinion according to his increasingly rigid worldview. The apology, when it came, was extracted under legal pressure, the result of a defamation lawsuit that threatened to expose Ford to a public reckoning he could not afford. By this time, the fortune that the Model T had generated was almost beyond comprehension. Ford was among the wealthiest men on earth, his name synonymous with American enterprise itself. He had built hospitals, schools, museums. He had attempted to end the First World War through personal diplomacy, chartering a peace ship that sailed to Europe in a quixotic effort to negotiate an armistice. He had been mentioned as a potential candidate for President of the United States. And in Dearborn, on 1,300 acres of land along the Rouge River, he had begun construction of an estate that would embody both his achievements and his contradictions. He called it Fair Lane, after the district in Ireland, where his father's family had originated. It would become his refuge, his laboratory, his fortress, a place where he could live according to his own principles, surrounded by the technologies he had mastered and insulated from the world he no longer fully understood. The architects Ford selected for Fair Lane were William Van Tyne and Marion Mahoney Griffin, both associated with the Prairie School movement that had emerged from Chicago under the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright. The choice was deliberate. Ford wanted a home that rejected the ornate European styles favored by the Eastern establishment, the Vanderbilts with their French chateaux, the Carnegies with their Scottish castles. He sought something rooted in the American landscape, a structure that would appear to grow from the Michigan soil rather than impose itself upon it. Construction began in 1914 and continued for more than 2 years. The main residence rose on a limestone bluff overlooking the Rouge River, its long horizontal lines echoing the flat terrain of the surrounding prairie. The exterior walls were faced with gray Marblehead limestone, quarried in Ohio and transported by rail to Dearborn. The roof was covered in tiles of green ceramic, designed to blend with the forest canopy when viewed from above. Every material, every proportion, was calculated to suggest harmony with the natural world. But the appearance of rustic simplicity concealed systems of extraordinary complexity. Beneath the estate, Ford constructed a powerhouse capable of generating electricity for the entire property, a private utility that freed Fair Lane from dependence on municipal infrastructure. The turbines were driven by water from the Rouge River, channeled through a dam that Ford's engineers had designed specifically for this purpose. The same water that powered the generators also fed an elaborate heating system, circulating through pipes embedded in the walls and floors to maintain constant temperatures throughout the mansion. The electrical infrastructure extended far beyond illumination. Ford installed an internal telephone network that connected every major room, allowing communication between family members, servants, and guests without the need for physical proximity. Intercoms were embedded in walls and concealed behind decorative panels. The system was presented as a modern convenience, a labor-saving innovation consistent with Ford's public image as a champion of technology. But its architecture also permitted something else, something that would only become apparent to those who worked within the estate's walls. The listening devices were not immediately visible. They were integrated into the telephone network, positioned in locations where conversations of significance might occur. The extent of the surveillance apparatus remains difficult to establish with certainty, as Ford was careful to limit knowledge of its existence to a small circle of trusted employees. But servants who worked at Fairlane during the 1920s and 30s later described an atmosphere of pervasive monitoring, a sense that private words might be recorded, that loyalty was constantly being tested. Ford's obsession with control extended beyond technology. The estate's grounds were patrolled by private security personnel, who reported directly to Harry Bennett, the former boxer and ex-Navy man who would become Ford's most trusted enforcer. Bennett's official title was head of the service department at Ford Motor Company, but his actual role encompassed functions that no corporate organizational chart could capture. He managed a network of informants within the factories. He maintained relationships with organized crime figures in Detroit. He intimidated union organizers, surveilled executives suspected of disloyalty, and cultivated an atmosphere of fear that permeated every level of the Ford enterprise. At Fairlane, Bennett's presence was less visible, but no less significant. The estate's security protocols reflected his influence. The careful screening of visitors, the observation of domestic staff, the quiet investigations into anyone who entered Ford's private world. The man who had built his fortune on efficiency and transparency had constructed a personal realm governed by secrecy and suspicion. The interior of the mansion revealed similar contradictions. Ford insisted that the furnishings reflect American craftsmanship, rejecting the imported antiques that filled the homes of his fellow industrialists. The furniture was solid, functional, devoid of excessive ornamentation. Yet the estate also contained rooms dedicated to Ford's growing collection of historical artifacts, objects that spoke to an idealized vision of the American past that may never have existed. He acquired violins and tools and agricultural implements from the 18th and 19th centuries, assembling a private museum of a vanished way of life. Clara Ford, for her part, maintained the household with quiet authority. She oversaw the domestic staff, managed the social calendar, and served as a moderating influence on her husband's more extreme impulses. The rose garden she cultivated became famous, its 10,000 plants drawing visitors from across the country. But even Clara operated within constraints defined by her husband's worldview. Fairlane was Henry's creation, designed according to his specifications, governed by his rules. She was its mistress, but he was its architect, in every sense of the word. Harry Bennett arrived at Ford Motor Company in 1916, hired initially as a watchman at the Rouge River plant. He was a compact, powerfully built man, with a background that included service in the Navy and experience in the rougher quarters of New York City. His talents were not administrative. He possessed a capacity for violence, a willingness to operate outside conventional boundaries, and an instinct for identifying and exploiting weakness in others. These qualities, which might have disqualified him from leadership in most corporations, made him indispensable to Henry Ford. The relationship between the two men deepened over the following decades, evolving into something that observers found difficult to categorize. Ford, who had grown increasingly suspicious of the executives who surrounded him, found in Bennett a loyalty that seemed absolute. Bennett, in turn, recognized that proximity to Ford offered power far exceeding any formal title. By the 1930s, he had become the second most influential figure in the Ford empire, answerable only to Henry himself, feared by everyone else. The service department that Bennett commanded was nominally responsible for plant security. In practice, it functioned as a private intelligence agency, its operatives embedded throughout the Ford organization. Workers suspected of union sympathies were identified, monitored, and frequently dismissed. Executives who questioned company policy found their movements tracked, their communications intercepted. The atmosphere within Ford factories during this period was later compared to that of a police state, a characterization that Bennett's own memoirs did little to dispute. At Fairlane, the influence of this apparatus was subtler, but no less pervasive. Guests who visited the estate were often unaware that their conversations might be recorded, their backgrounds investigated before their arrival. Servants understood that their continued employment depended on discretion, not merely regarding the Ford family's private affairs, but regarding the systems of observation that surrounded them. The estate's elaborate communication network, so impressive as a technological achievement, doubled as an instrument of surveillance. Ford's anxieties during this period had multiple sources. The labor movement, which had organized successfully at General Motors and Chrysler, represented an existential threat to his vision of industrial management. Ford had always insisted that his relationship with workers was direct and paternalistic, that unions were unnecessary intrusions between a benevolent employer and his grateful employees. The prospect of collective bargaining challenged not merely his business model, but his understanding of his own virtue. Yet the fear of unions was intertwined with darker preoccupations. Ford remained convinced that labor agitation was orchestrated by Jewish financiers and Bolshevik revolutionaries working in concert to undermine American industry. The Dearborn Independent had ceased publication in 1927, following the lawsuit that forced Ford's reluctant apology. But the ideas it had disseminated continued to circulate within Ford's inner circle. Bennett shared his employer's conspiratorial worldview, as did many of the men who staffed the service department. The violence that accompanied Ford's resistance to unionization reached its peak in May of 1937. Organizers from the United Automobile Workers, attempting to distribute leaflets near the Rouge River plant, were attacked by Bennett's men in an incident that became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Photographs captured Ford security personnel beating union representatives, including Walter Reuther, who would later become one of the most prominent labor leaders in American history. The images circulated widely, damaging Ford's reputation as a friend of the working man. Yet even this public relations disaster failed to alter the fundamental dynamics within the Ford organization. Bennett retained his position. The surveillance apparatus continued to operate. Henry Ford, now in his mid-70s, seemed incapable of recognizing how far his company had drifted from the principles he claimed to champion. The man who had once doubled wages to create a new class of consumer workers now presided over a regime of intimidation that treated those same workers as potential enemies. Within Fairlane, the contradictions accumulated in silence. Ford spent increasing amounts of time in his private study, surrounded by the artifacts of a simpler past he believed he remembered. He tinkered with antique machinery, collected fiddles, and spoke nostalgically of the agrarian values his own factories had helped to destroy. The Rouge River plant, visible in the distance from certain windows of the estate, continued to produce automobiles at a pace that would have seemed miraculous a generation earlier. But the world it had created was not the world Ford had imagined, and the methods required to maintain his control over that world had long since ceased to resemble anything that could be called benevolent. The first stroke came in 1938. It was not immediately announced to the public, and its severity was minimized in the few accounts that did emerge. But those who saw Henry Ford in the months that followed recognized that something fundamental had changed. His movements became slower, more deliberate. His attention wandered during the conversations. The relentless energy that had driven him for 7 decades now flickered unpredictably, present one moment and absent the next. The timing could not have been worse for the Ford Motor Company. General Motors and Chrysler had both signed contracts with the United Automobile Workers, leaving Ford as the last major holdout against unionization. The pressure was immense, from workers, from the government, from a public that increasingly viewed Ford's resistance as obstinacy rather than principle. Yet the man who would need to navigate this crisis was no longer fully capable of strategic thought. Into this vacuum stepped the figures who had long competed for influence within the Ford organization. Harry Bennett, sensing opportunity in his patron's diminished state, consolidated his control over day-to-day operations. Edsel Ford, Henry's only son, found himself marginalized despite holding the title of company president. The tension between these two men, and between the visions of the company they represented, would define the Ford Motor Company's trajectory through the war years. Edsel had never been the son his father wanted. Where Henry was rough-hewn and confrontational, Edsel was refined, diplomatic, inclined toward conciliation. He appreciated art, collected modern paintings, and built a home in Grosse Pointe that reflected tastes his father considered effete. More significantly, Edsel understood that the company needed to modernize, to replace the aging Model T philosophy with designs that could compete with the increasingly sophisticated offerings from General Motors. He advocated for hydraulic brakes, for updated styling, for a management structure that did not depend entirely on one man's intuition. Henry Ford rejected these suggestions with a ferocity that bewildered outside observers. He countermanded Edsel's decisions publicly, humiliating his son in front of subordinates. He allowed Bennett to undermine Edsel's authority at every turn, sometimes appearing to take pleasure in the resulting conflicts. The psychological dynamics of this relationship remain difficult to parse. Some historians have suggested that Ford saw in Edsel the softness he feared in himself, that the violence of his rejection was a form of self-discipline projected onto his heir. Others have pointed to Ford's fundamental inability to relinquish control, his conviction that no one else could be trusted to preserve what he had built. The consequences of this dysfunction became apparent during the Second World War. Ford Motor Company had converted to military production, manufacturing aircraft engines, jeeps, and the B-24 Liberator bomber at the massive Willow Run plant. The scale of this effort was staggering. At peak production, a new bomber rolled off the line every hour. Yet the company's internal chaos threatened to undermine the entire enterprise. Government officials complained of delays, inefficiencies, and a management structure that seemed designed to prevent rather than facilitate decision-making. Edsel Ford worked himself to exhaustion, attempting to meet the demands of wartime production while navigating the impossible politics of his father's court. His health deteriorated visibly. In the spring of 1943, he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, though some medical historians have suggested that undulant fever, contracted from unpasteurized milk his father insisted he drink, may have contributed to his decline. Henry Ford had long championed raw milk as part of his philosophy of natural living. Whether this conviction played a role in his son's illness remains a matter of speculation. Edsel Ford died on May 26, 1943. He was 49 years old. The funeral was held at Christ Church, Cranbrook, and the mourners included many who had witnessed the painful dynamics between father and son. Henry Ford attended, but appeared confused, disoriented, whether from grief or from the neurological damage of his strokes, observers could not say. In the weeks that followed, he seemed unable to fully comprehend that his son was gone. The death of Edsel created a succession crisis that threatened the very survival of the Ford Motor Company. Henry, now 80 years old and visibly declining, resumed the presidency he had nominally relinquished to his son decades earlier. Bennett's influence reached its zenith. The company drifted, its wartime contracts providing temporary stability, but its long-term future increasingly uncertain. Clara Ford had endured decades of her husband's obsessions in silence. She had watched him publish anti-Semitic propaganda, cultivate relationships with men of questionable character, and systematically undermine their only child. She had maintained the household at Fair Lane, tended her roses, and presented to the world an image of domestic tranquility that bore little resemblance to the reality within those walls. But the death of Edsel and the chaos that followed finally exhausted her patience. The intervention came in the summer of 1943. Clara informed her husband that if he did not relinquish control of the company to their grandson, Henry Ford II, she would leave him. The threat was extraordinary, not merely because divorce would have been scandalous for a family of their prominence, but because it represented the first time Clara had openly defied her husband on a matter of significance. Those who witnessed the confrontation understood that she meant what she said. Henry Ford II was 25 years old and serving in the Navy when the summons came. He had grown up in the shadow of the conflict between his father and grandfather, aware from an early age that the family business was also a family battleground. His own relationship with the elder Ford was complicated, affectionate at times, wary at others, shaped by the knowledge that loyalty to his father had made him suspect in his grandfather's eyes. Now he was being asked to assume control of one of the largest industrial enterprises in the world, at a moment when that enterprise was hemorrhaging talent and direction. The transition did not happen immediately. Henry Ford clung to his authority with the tenacity that had characterized his entire career, agreeing in principle to step aside while continuing to interfere in practice. Bennett, recognizing that his position depended entirely on the elder Ford's favor, worked to delay and complicate the succession. Documents were hidden. Executives who supported the younger Henry found themselves transferred or dismissed. The company's internal politics became a shadow war, fought in memoranda and meetings, while the factories continued their wartime production. The resolution came in September of 1945, shortly after the Japanese surrender ended the Second World War. Henry Ford II, having consolidated sufficient support among the board of directors, formally assumed the presidency. His first significant act was to summon Harry Bennett to his office and demand his resignation. The encounter was brief. Bennett, who had spent decades cultivating an image of menace, offered no resistance. He left the Rouge River plant that afternoon and never returned. The purge that followed was systematic. Executives associated with Bennett's regime were dismissed. The service department was disbanded, its surveillance apparatus dismantled. Investigators discovered files documenting decades of espionage against Ford employees, records of intercepted communications, reports from informants, dossiers on union organizers and their families. The scope of the operation exceeded what even critics had imagined. At Fair Lane, these developments registered only faintly. Henry Ford had retreated into a private world, shaped by memory and confusion. He wandered the grounds of the estate, sometimes speaking to servants about events from decades past, as though they had occurred that morning. He sat for hours in the powerhouse, watching the turbines that had once represented his mastery over natural forces. The man who had bent the world to his will now struggled to remember the names of those who cared for him. Clara remained by his side, as she had for nearly 60 years. Whatever resentment she harbored, whatever disappointments had accumulated across the decades, she did not abandon him in his decline. The household staff maintained their routines, preserving the rhythms of the estate, even as its master faded. Visitors were rare now. The dignitaries and industrialists who had once sought Ford's counsel had moved on to other concerns. The world he had helped create continued to evolve, but he was no longer part of its conversations. The strokes continued, each one diminishing him further. His physicians could offer little beyond palliative care. The damage to his brain was progressive and irreversible, eroding the capacities that had once made him formidable. He became gentler in his final years, more dependent, less suspicious, almost childlike in his needs. Some who witnessed this transformation found it poignant. Others recalled the harm he had caused and felt the gentleness had come too late. The Rouge River, which had powered his estate and his factories, flowed past Fair Lane, as it always had. The seasons turned. The gardens Clara had cultivated continued to bloom each spring. And somewhere within the 56 rooms of the mansion, Henry Ford waited for an ending he could no longer fully comprehend. The winter of 1947 was unremarkable by Michigan standards. Snow fell and melted and fell again across the grounds of Fair Lane. The Rouge River, fed by the runoff from surrounding farmland, rose gradually through February and March. The estate's maintenance staff monitored the water levels with the vigilance that decades of experience had instilled, aware that the powerhouse dam required constant attention during the thaw. Henry Ford spent these months in a routine that had grown increasingly circumscribed. He rose early, as he always had, but the mornings no longer held the promise of activity they once contained. He took meals with Clara in the breakfast room, picking at food he no longer tasted with much interest. He walked the corridors of the mansion when his strength permitted, pausing before paintings and artifacts that had accumulated across decades of collecting. Whether he remembered how they had come to be there, or what significance they once held, was unclear even to those who accompanied him. Visitors during this period were carefully managed. The family had learned that unfamiliar faces could agitate the old man, triggering confusion or distress that took hours to subside. Henry Ford II came when business permitted, though his attention was necessarily consumed by the task of rebuilding the company his grandfather had nearly destroyed. The younger executives and engineers who were transforming Ford Motor Company into a modern corporation had little reason to make the pilgrimage to Fair Lane. The era it represented was precisely what they were working to leave behind. Clara maintained her own routines with a discipline that seemed to intensify as her husband faded. The rose garden, dormant through the winter, still required planning and preparation for the spring planting. She corresponded with horticultural societies, ordered bulbs and specimens, and supervised the groundskeepers who would execute her designs. This continuity was perhaps a form of hope, a belief that the seasons would continue to turn, that beauty would persist despite the losses that surrounded her. The household staff during these final months numbered fewer than a dozen. The elaborate entertaining that had once characterized Fair Lane had ceased years earlier. The kitchens that had prepared banquets for industrialists and dignitaries now produced simple meals for an elderly couple and their caregivers. Many of the mansion's rooms stood unused, their furnishings draped in protective covers, their windows dark even when the rest of the estate was illuminated. The isolation of Fair Lane had always been by design. Ford had built the estate to separate himself from a world he found increasingly incomprehensible, to create a private domain governed by his own principles. But the isolation that had once felt like sovereignty now resembled something closer to exile. The industry he had revolutionized was entering a post-war boom that would transform American society yet again. Highways were being planned that would dwarf anything Ford had imagined. Suburbs were spreading across landscapes that had been farmland within living memory. The automobile culture Ford had pioneered was becoming the defining feature of American life. And yet the man himself sat in a darkened room in Dearborn, attended by nurses and servants, waiting for an end that approached with terrible patience. The flood that struck in April was not unprecedented. The Rouge River had overflowed its banks before, and the estate's infrastructure had been designed to withstand such events. But the water rose higher than the engineers had anticipated, driven by an unusually rapid snowmelt combined with sustained spring rains. On the evening of April 7th, the powerhouse generators failed. The electrical systems that Ford had installed with such pride, the networks of wires and switches and monitoring devices that had made Fairlane a marvel of private engineering, went dark. The symbolism was not lost on those who witnessed it, though none would have spoken of it at the time. The servants moved through the mansion with candles and lanterns, illuminating rooms that had not known such light in decades. Clara sat with her husband in the bedroom they had shared for most of their married life. Outside, the river continued to rise, indifferent to the human drama unfolding on its banks. Henry Ford's breathing grew labored as the evening progressed. The physicians who attended him could offer little beyond comfort. His body, which had carried him through 83 years of relentless activity, was finally surrendering to the accumulated damage of strokes and age, and a lifetime of conviction that will alone could overcome any obstacle. Clara held his hand as the hours passed, speaking softly, though whether he could hear her or understand her words was impossible to know. He died at 11:40 in the evening, by candlelight, in a house without power. The man who had electrified an industry, who had put the world on wheels, who had built an empire on the principle that technology could solve any problem. This man died in darkness, attended only by his wife and a handful of servants, while the river he had dammed and harnessed flowed past his windows, beyond his control at last. The news of Henry Ford's death reached the wire services before midnight. By morning, it had circulated around the world. Newspapers that had chronicled his rise, his triumphs, and his controversies now composed the final chapter of a story that had shaped the 20th century. The obituaries were lengthy, and for the most part, reverential. They emphasized the farm boy who had democratized the automobile, the industrialist who had paid his workers wages that seemed impossibly generous, the philanthropist who had built hospitals and schools and museums. The darker chapters, the anti-Semitic publications, the labor violence, the Nazi medal, appeared in some accounts, but were often treated as aberrations, footnotes to a life whose achievements outweighed its failures. The funeral was held on April 10th at St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral in Detroit. An estimated 30,000 people filed past the open casket in the hours before the service, paying respects to a man most of them had never met, but whose products had transformed their daily lives. The line stretched for blocks through downtown Detroit, a city that Ford's factories had helped build and that now paused to acknowledge its debt. Inside the cathedral, the invited mourners included governors and senators, industrialists and labor leaders, figures from every sector of American life who understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. Clara Ford sat in the front pew, dressed in black, her composure unbroken throughout the service. She was 80 years old, and she had spent nearly 60 of those years as Henry Ford's wife. Whatever grief she felt, she did not display it publicly. The self-control she had cultivated across decades of managing her husband's household served her now, allowing her to endure the ceremony with a dignity that impressed even those who had criticized her husband most harshly. The burial took place at Ford Cemetery in Detroit, a small graveyard where Henry's parents and other family members already lay. The grave was marked simply, without the elaborate monuments that other men of his wealth might have demanded. This modesty was consistent with the public image Ford had cultivated, the plain-spoken mechanic who had never lost touch with his rural origins. Whether it reflected genuine humility or merely another form of performance was a question that each observer answered according to their own understanding of the man. Fairlane fell quiet after the funeral. Clara returned to the estate and resumed the routines that had structured her days for more than 3 decades. She tended her gardens, corresponded with friends, and received occasional visitors who came to pay their respects. The household staff remained, though their numbers diminished as the months passed. The mansion no longer required the elaborate maintenance that had characterized its earlier years. It was a widow's home now, scaled to the needs of a single elderly woman rather than the ambitions of an industrial titan. The solitude suited Clara in some ways. She had spent her married life accommodating her husband's obsessions, managing his household, and moderating his excesses when she could. Now, for the first time since her youth, she was free to live according to her own preferences. She read, she gardened, she entertained the grandchildren who visited during holidays. The tensions that had characterized Fairlane during Henry's final years gradually dissipated, replaced by something closer to peace. But the estate itself was becoming an anachronism. The private power plant that Henry had built with such pride required constant maintenance and expertise that grew harder to justify for a single household. The elaborate systems of communication and climate control demanded attention that seemed disproportionate to their utility. Clara lacked her husband's fascination with machinery and saw no reason to preserve technologies that had outlived their purpose. Gradually, Fairlane began to rely on municipal utilities. Its independence surrendered to practicality. Clara Ford died on September 27, 1950, 3 years after her husband. She was 84 years old. The funeral was smaller than Henry's had been, the mourners fewer, the public attention diminished. She was buried beside her husband in Ford Cemetery, their graves marked by matching headstones that gave no indication of the complexities their marriage had contained. The disposition of Fairlane had been determined before Clara's death. The estate was bequeathed to the University of Michigan, which accepted it with expressions of gratitude and little clear sense of what to do with it. The mansion was too large and too specialized for academic purposes. Its systems were outdated, its maintenance costs substantial. For years, the university struggled to find a viable use for the property, while the building slowly deteriorated and the gardens Clara had cultivated grew wild. The estate stands today as a museum, restored through decades of effort to something approaching its original condition. Visitors walk the corridors, where servants once moved in careful silence, peer into rooms where decisions were made that shaped the course of industries and nations. The power